Morning, everyone. The Business and Energy Secretary Grant Shapps has described his horror at a report that British gas contractors have been forcing entry into vulnerable people's homes to fit prepayment meters. British Gas parent company Centrica says it's suspended the use of court warrants that allowed forced installations after an investigation by the Times newspaper. In response to that investigation, Mr Shapps has tweeted, "I'm horrified by the findings of this investigation by the Times. I've asked Energy Minister Graham Stewart to hold a meeting with the company in the coming days, and he will be demanding answers to ensure this systemic failure is addressed." Well, let's get more, should we? Matt standing by for us outside Centrica's headquarters in Windsor. Hello to you. Good morning. What on earth is going on here?
I mean, it's a fairly jaw-dropping story, actually, in the Times this morning, finding that debt collectors working for British Gas have been obtaining court warrants to forcibly enter the homes of sometimes vulnerable customers and install prepayment meters. Now, the issue of prepayment meters has been in the news for some time after it emerged towards the end of last year that a number of energy companies were using these kind of practices to put sometimes very poor, struggling customers onto prepayment meters. And clearly what happens is if they are suddenly unable to put money in their meter, well, then their energy supplies are cut off. And so for that reason, the Energy Secretary Grant Shapps wrote to energy companies in January urging them to stop the practice. But what's happened is the Times has gone undercover with a company called Arvato Financial Solutions, which is a debt collection agency used by British Gas. And it's found some really quite alarming practices, including, for example, a bonus culture in which there were bonuses given to staff for installing these prepayment meters, which therefore caused them to perhaps disregard the vulnerabilities of some of their customers, people with disabilities, people with young children, for example. And actually, it's possible that some of the practices are in breach of the regulator Ofgem's licensing conditions. The Ofgem has told the Times in a statement that the concern, their story is alarming, and that Ofgem are urgently investigating. And the owner of British Gas, Centrica, has said in a rather lengthy statement that protecting vulnerable customers is an absolute priority, and we have clear processes and policies to ensure we manage customer debt carefully and safely. More broadly, they said there are clearly significant challenges around affordability, and unfortunately, we don't see that changing anytime soon. We need to strike a balance between managing spiralling bad debt and being aware that there are those who refuse to pay and those who cannot pay. But I also thought it was notable, Kay, that British Gas said in a statement to the Times that this is not who we are, this is not how we do business. Except the problem is, it rather seems that that's exactly how they were doing business until such time as a newspaper uncovered the practices. OK, for now, thank you. Well, that investigation into British Gas comes as the cost of living crisis continues to grow. Later on today, the Bank of England is expected to raise the official base rate of interest for the 10th time in a row. It's currently at 3.5%. And is expected to increase to 4% after a meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee. It's already at its highest level for 14 years. And we'll have more on this with our business presenter, Ian King, a little bit later on in the programme. Meantime, water bills in England and Wales are also set to rise. In April, they'll go up by 7.5%, the biggest jump in almost 20 years. It'll mean the average household will pay £448 a year. Water UK says it reflects higher energy costs for suppliers. Vulnerable children should be supported to stay with their families in safe and loving homes under new plans being set out today. The government's offering more help to family members who take over the care of a child, including aunties, uncles and grandparents, to keep them out of the care system. One grandmother told us she was paying £2,000 a month to care for her grandson. Here's Jason Farrell.
Right, do you want to get your scooter?
Sam, who we won't identify, could no longer be cared for by his parents.
What good hand-holding.
So his grandmother, Sandra, stepped in.
One for you and one for the ducks, please.
He was just 14 months old and came with symptoms of trauma.
Shall I watch your scooter?
Sandra's retirement plans suddenly took a turn.
So life very different.
It's very different. I'd planned for 5 years' time to retire. I can't do that any longer because I've spent most of my savings now to bring him up as far as he has. We've incurred expenses from nursery school and his therapy. It was just under £2,000 a month.
Yeah.
There was no support at all. I found those first couple of months, if I'm honest, horrendous, absolutely horrendous.
A review into the care system published last year found kinship carers, such as grandparents and aunts, were undervalued. And today the government is introducing measures to support wider family networks to keep children out of the care system. With £45 million earmarked for early intervention for struggling families, the government will provide training and support for kinship carers. And £25 million is being invested in recruiting and retaining foster carers.
Should we go and sit?
The Lib Dems say it's not enough and want to give kinship carers financial support in line with that offered to foster parents. Their leader, Ed Davey, was himself raised in part by his grandparents.
That's my nana and granddad.
He lost his father when he was 4 and his mother died of cancer when he was 15. The pressure on his grandparents losing their daughter and raising him is something that stays with him.
And I wrote this essay for my assessed English O-level. It was all about this, how it was coming home with the tension and knowing what my mother was going through. So I find this difficult now. My teacher said he couldn't mark it because it was so raw.
Yeah. Because it's that mother-daughter relationship as well, which is...
And I was right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But it was, you know, they were both wonderful, lovely people. Well, all three of them. My mother was special. It's just one of these things. But that's why kinship care is so important. Because you don't have that with anyone else.
There's a record number of children in the care system and it's set to rise. The question is, will this extra help for children like Sam be enough to reverse that trend? Jason Farrell, Sky News.
We'll have Sir Ed actually here in the studio with us a little bit later on, talking more about that story. Meantime, almost a week on and the mystery of a missing mum of 2 in Lancashire remains unsolved. Nicola Bully's parents say they fear somebody's got her. They've asked police whether there is any chance of her being taken after the 45-year-old vanished while walking her dog. A partner of 12 years, Paul Ansell, has said her daughters are desperate to have their mummy back home safe with them. He said they're living through a perpetual hell and utter disbelief. Police, divers, drones, dogs and helicopters and mountain rescuers are now involved in the search in Lancashire for Nicola. Lancashire Police say they are extremely concerned about Miss Bully's welfare. Friends and family have also been part of a widespread community search. Nicola went missing early on Friday morning after travelling from her home in Inskip to the nearby village of St Michael's on Wyre, approximately a 10-minute drive. She dropped her children off at school before heading on the walk with her dog. She then made her way onto a footpath by the river where she was last seen at around 9:15 a.m. Police later found Nicola's mobile phone on a bench on a footpath, still connected to a conference call, and her spaniel was also found nearby. Centralised search efforts are being conducted around the area near the bench where her phone was discovered. Meanwhile, police dive teams, mountain rescue volunteers and local community members continue to search along and in the River Wyre. We'll be live at the scene in just a short time. Meantime, a royal row erupted in Australia after it was announced that the Queen's image won't be replaced with that of King Charles on its $5 banknotes. Instead, it'll feature the first Australians. Nicole is standing by for us this morning. Hello to you, Nicole. A very good morning to you. Tell us more about this, another snub for the royals.
Well, first of all, it's come as a big surprise to many Australians, but most people I've spoken to have said that they support it. It is a significant change for there to be no member of the royal family on an Australian banknote. And this will take a number of years to come into effect, though. In the meantime, King Charles will be on Australian coins. But it's a real sign that in this era, after the death of Queen Elizabeth II, that change is afoot in Australia. This decision was made by the central bank, along with the support of the federal government. Let's take a listen to what Australia's Treasurer had to say about it.
The monarch will still be on the coins, but the $5 note will say more about our history and our heritage and our country, and I see that as a good thing.
This is much more than a debate about simply a $5 note. It will be replaced with an image that means something to Indigenous Australians, and that is one of the central debates here in this country this year. Later in the year, there'll be a referendum about an Indigenous voice to Parliament in Australia. It's already proving incredibly divisive. The big question is how to close the gap between the appalling living conditions that Indigenous Australians live in compared with non-Indigenous Australians.
OK, thank you. In the US, family and friends of Tyre Nichols have attended his funeral in Memphis. The US Vice President Kamala Harris was among those who delivered speeches describing Mr Nichols' death after being beaten by the police as a violent act that went against the police mission to keep people safe. James Matthews has more.
This was a funeral and far more. Its congregation voiced our country's concern at what had brought them here.
Kamala Harris.
The Vice President grieved with the mother of Tyre Nichols and spoke for a government.
This is a family that lost their son and their brother through an act of violence at the hands and the feet of people who had been charged with keeping them safe.
We were shown fresh pictures of Tyre Nichols. He wasn't the only victim of police violence represented here at his funeral.
I know the family of George Floyd is here. Stand up.
Relatives of others who died previously travelled to Memphis.
Come on.
It was the past and present standing side by side for change in future.
We have to fight for justice. We cannot continue to let these people brutalize our kids.
In the wake of the video release of Tyre Nichols' fatal beating, the Memphis Fire Department has announced that 3 employees have been sacked for failing to assist him. This after the firing of the 5 police officers facing charges of second-degree murder. They were addressed directly at his funeral, here in the city that saw the assassination of Martin Luther King, the civil rights leader who had a dream.
In the city where the dreamer laid down and shed his blood, you have the unmitigated gall to beat your brother, chase him down and beat him some more.
As she lay her son to rest, the mother of Tyre Nichols talked politics, urging the adoption of the so-called George Floyd bill to limit police immunity. It was a mother's plea to a nation's politicians.
We need to get that bill passed. Amen. Because if we don't, that blood, the next child that dies, that blood is going to be on their hands. Yeah.
James Matthews, Sky News, Washington.
Taking you to South Africa in just a moment, but let me tell you some breaking news in the last few moments. Shell profits increased by, have a guess, 53%, $84.3 billion. That's £68.1 billion due to soaring oil prices. That, according to Shell, within the last few moments. No doubt the government will come under pressure for that windfall tax again. So those are the latest figures, £6 billion and change, the profits for Shell, up 53%. Also making news for you this morning, and a 32-year-old man has been charged with the murder of Natalie McNally, who was stabbed in her home in Northern Ireland. He's due to appear in court today. Ms McNally was 15 weeks pregnant when she was stabbed. Police in eastern Ukraine say a Russian missile has destroyed an apartment building and damaged 7 others in the city of Kramatorsk. At least 2 people were killed, 20 injured, and it's likely more are stuck beneath the rubble. Microplastics used in food packaging and paint have been found in human veins. A new study suggests microplastics can pass through blood vessels to vascular tissue, but scientists said it was not clear yet what the implications are for human health. As promised, let's take you to South Africa, where ongoing power blackouts are threatening to cripple the economy. A protest march is taking place in Johannesburg this morning as the country has warned the energy crisis could last another 2 years. Well, joining us now is Yusra El-Baghia. Hi, Yusra. I mean, I've followed this story quite closely. Weirdly, it's called load shedding, I believe, even though it's a blackout, and it doesn't look as though the infrastructure can cope.
No, it doesn't at all. I mean, we could very confidently say that South Africa is in a state of infrastructural collapse at the moment, and there's a lot of discontent and dissatisfaction in the lack of clarity around how this will be dealt with and when people will find relief from these ongoing power cuts. And today people are planning to march here to Eskom's headquarters. Eskom is the sole power producer of the country, and this is the megawatt park, which is industrial, which is the headquarters of the entire operation. They're calling for consistent, reliable and affordable electricity supply, something that the country hasn't seen in the last few years. And earlier this week, Eskom announced that they'd be implementing stage 6 load shedding. Now, what that means is up to 9.5 hours of no power. And that doesn't even include the unscheduled power cuts that we're seeing around substations breaking down, around power surges taking local areas off the grid, and it's really impacting all walks of life here for people. The economy is being heavily impacted. Economists estimate that the economy is 8 to 10% smaller than it would be if it were not for Eskom's failings, that the economy is losing up to $200 million, over $200 million in GDP per day. People's local businesses are being impacted. People's daily lives are impacted. But more than anything, it is an issue of life or death. Public hospitals here are collapsing under the strain of running on generators for a majority of the day. And the Minister of Health reported only 43 of South Africa's 400 hospitals are exempt from load shedding. So people have a lot to protest about, Kay.
Indeed. So keep us updated, if you will. Thanks for now. Thank you. Still to come on the programme for you, as promised, the Lib Dem leader, Sir Ed Davey, will be here with us. Also speaking to the former NHS Chief Exec, Lord Nigel Crisp, about the crisis facing the health service. And just after 8, joined by the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, Lisa Nandy. Further questions swirling for the Prime Minister about what, if any, knowledge he had of bullying allegations against his deputy, Dominic Raab, before he was appointed the Deputy Prime Minister and the Justice Secretary. Here's what happened at PMQs yesterday.
How would he feel if one of his friends or relatives was being forced to work for a bully simply because the man at the top was too weak to do anything about it?
Mr. Speaker, I noticed he didn't say anything about why one of his own MPs describes being in his own party. And Mr. Differ, when I was made aware of formal complaints, I instructed a leading independent KC to conduct an investigation because I take action when these things happen.
OK, let's look at that in more detail. Dave Penman is General Secretary of the 1st Division Association Union. Hi, it's good to see you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. So, talk to us in more detail about that then. What kind of an impact has Dominic Raab's alleged bullying had on civil servants in his department?
Well, I think it's important that we don't go into details of the allegations. They're being investigated and confidentiality is critical.
I'm asking you about the impact.
I've spoken to people who are civil servants working and have worked for Dominic Raab, who have suffered mental health crisis, have lost their careers, essentially, because they've had to move and change jobs. Bullying has an enormous impact on individuals. It's about an abuse of power. And in many cases, there's no greater power dynamic than someone who is a government minister or a deputy prime minister and a civil servant. And where that gets abused, it can have significant consequences for individuals.
How many people are we talking about?
I don't know exactly. There are 8 complaints, of which we understand, I think, a couple of dozen civil servants are involved in it. It covers 3 different government departments. It covers a period of about 4 years. And in any other employment context, if that was you, me or anyone else in the workplace up and down the country, the employer would consider suspending someone, because with allegations so significant, you have to have regard for your current employees and whether essentially you're putting them in harm's way if potentially someone who is could be a prolific bully is still allowed to be in the workplace. And that's what the Prime Minister should address and address urgently.
Lots to talk about there. Let me unpack it if I may. So you say at least 8 allegations covering a couple of dozen civil servants. What has been the outcome for some of those civil servants? You say they've lost their careers.
Yeah, they've moved. If you're in a workplace where you're being bullied, where the daily grind of coming to work destroys your mental health, then that has an impact on your career. But, you know, these jobs, working with ministers, in many ways are the pinnacle of a civil servant's career. It's at the top of the civil service, doing some of the most important jobs in the civil service. And to leave that as part of your career or be forced out because you can't cope with it is hugely damaging to your career and your life.
Well, let me put this to you. Jacob Rees-Mogg was sat where you are a couple of days ago, and this is what he had to say.
Is it reasonable to demand from senior and well-paid professionals a level of good service? And then you have to judge whether that line has been overstepped. But I do worry that we are getting a bit snowflakey about this.
Bit snowflakey?
I was astonished by those comments. Jacob Rees-Mogg was leader of the House of Commons. I know that he met with people who were the victims of bullying in the Commons. He's heard firsthand what it's like to be on the wrong end of bullying, and to talk about snowflakery in those terms is just astonishing from someone in his position. This sort of behaviour destroys lives. I mean, it's not just about careers. People's lives and their mental health are at risk when they're subject to systematic bullying. And to belittle it in that way is absolutely outrageous from a former leader of the House and Cabinet Minister.
Well, let me put this to you from the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan.
I think actually it was Dom himself who instigated this investigation. So that's ongoing. I sit around the cabinet table and, you know, don't see that, right? I don't see any, you know, I feel very comfortable with my colleagues around the cabinet table.
Doesn't see any bullying, is what she's saying.
Bullying is about the abuse of power. So the power dynamic between the Secretary of State for Education and the Deputy Prime Minister is very different from the power dynamic between a minister and a civil servant. So ministers should know that. When they talk about they haven't witnessed it, they wouldn't witness it because they are in a different position from a civil servant or someone who can be bullied by someone as powerful as a Deputy Prime Minister.
Why should he be suspended?
Because you or I or anyone else would be if we were in that situation. Why should government ministers be any different? If any employer faces significant allegations against someone, they have to look at their current employees. And if you're faced with 8 separate allegations from 3 different parts of your organisation over a period of 4 years involving dozens of people, that suggests there is a real issue there and a real danger for the health and safety of current staff until you can establish guilt or innocence. You have to protect your current workforce.
Well, we spoke to Number 10 about this morning, and they said that there's a long-standing principle that ministers should continue to carry out their duties while an investigation is ongoing.
The Prime Minister is also Minister for the Civil Service. He has an obligation to civil servants. If it concludes at the end of this investigation that it's correct, that Dominic Raab is a bully, that all of those allegations are correct, what it means is, in the meantime, he has been allowed potentially to bully civil servants whilst he's the Secretary of State. That is the issue that the Prime Minister needs to contend with. He wants this power. He has decided he will not allow an independent system to deal with complaints, and with that power comes responsibility, including protecting current civil servants.
Friends of Dominic Raab, who work within government, including 2 senior civil servants, saying that this is a clear attempt by politically motivated mandarins to get him.
That's extraordinary, and it couldn't be further from the truth. In actual fact, I've spoken to people who didn't raise concerns at the time because they understood the political impact of it. They were reticent about challenging behaviour because they understood at that point in time it would be seen as a politically motivated attack. Civil servants are politically impartial. They want to serve the government of the day and do the best job, but they have to be protected and work in an environment where they are not bullied for doing that. And to suggest that they actually have got some political motivation, are we really saying 24 civil servants in 3 different government departments over a period of 4 years have got together with some massive conspiracy? That just doesn't to sound credible.
Why have they waited years to come forward?
Because it's really difficult to raise complaints. Again, I've spoken to some of the people involved in this, and they said they'll look at what happened with Priti Patel. The Prime Minister was forced into an investigation. He sat on that report for 6 months, and when he was forced to actually conclude on it, he ignored the recommendations that she had bullied civil servants and breached the ministerial code. So they got a clear message. The only way you can complain about a minister is to go through the Prime Minister, and that Prime Minister was not interested in allegations against his political allies.
When do you think he knew? When do you think this Prime Minister knew about allegations against his
deputy? Well, the reports are that he was briefed, and if you look at what he says, he's telling us what he doesn't know. He isn't telling us what he does know. I think the Prime Minister needs to come clean. It would be normal practice that when a Prime Minister is appointing Cabinet Ministers, he would be told of any concerns. Whether that was a formal complaint or not, he may well have been aware that there were concerns about Dominic Raab's behaviour.
May well, you don't think...
Well, we don't know, because he won't answer the question. He point-blankly refuses to say whether he was told about informal complaints about Dominic Raab. And if he was, what did he do with that? Did he decide that wasn't important? If those concerns were raised about his behaviour, that really didn't matter. What was more important was giving a job to a political ally. We need to know, and the reason why we need to know is because the Prime Minister has to decide on this investigation. The KC involved doesn't decide on it, he only establishes a fact. So the Prime Minister is the one who, at the end of the day, has to make a determination.
We've just had this from the PM's press secretary. So let me put this to you and see what you say in the result. The PM was not aware of any formal complaints at the time of appointing Dominic Raab.
Yes, that's what he keeps saying. He keeps relying...
Do you dispute that?
No, because there were no formal complaints, because the only way you can make a formal complaint is for the Prime Minister of the day to agree that there would be an investigation. He's not being asked whether there were formal complaints. He's asked about whether he was aware of any informal concerns about Dominic Raab. And once again, he is refusing to answer that point.
Let me ask you one final question, if I may. We had Labour on the programme yesterday. They said that he needs to be suspended as a matter of urgency because there are concerns about not only the welfare but also the safety of those people in his department. Is that going too far?
It's not going too far. That's what would happen to anyone else in this country. Why should government ministers be exempt from what would be the rules that apply to everyone else? Faced with significant allegations of bullying, it would be normal practice to suspend someone until such times if you've been able to establish whether they are valid or not. That's what should happen in this case.
OK, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Thank you. Well, Mr Raab has always insisted that he has behaved professionally at all times in denying the allegations of bullying and intimidating behaviour. We will continue, of course, to cover that story for you here on Sky News. Quick look at the weather for you now.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Next few days, generally mild and mainly fine in the south, but the north can expect more wind and rain.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Hello again, everybody. Rishi Sunak is under a growing pressure, as you know, to explain what he knew when about bullying allegations surrounding Dominic Raab, Deputy Prime Minister. Joining us is leader of the Lib Dems, Sir Ed Davey. Hi, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us on the programme. What needs to happen as far as Dominic Raab is concerned in the interim?
Well, he should be suspended from his job. I think viewers will be shocked that with these hugely serious allegations, up to 24 allegations, we're told, of bullying, and he's still serving. At the very least, he should be suspended pending this inquiry. And there is a question mark over Rishi Sunak himself. You know, 100 days into his job, he had a very bad appointment of Suella Braverman, who had broken the ministerial code, and he put her back in office. We know now about Nadeem Zahawi. He apparently had been told about the tax problem for the former now chairman of the Conservative Party, and now he's not suspending his Deputy Prime Minister with these serious allegations. I think the question marks are now not just about Dominic Raab, but about the Prime Minister. But
we heard from Downing Street this morning, actually. They say principle dictates that ministers carry on with their duties while any investigation is ongoing.
Well, I have to say, it wouldn't happen in a normal job, would it? If you were a civil servant, if you were a journalist, if you were in so many walks of life, if the level of these allegations, very serious allegations made, you would be given gardening leave. You wouldn't be at your desk. And, you know, they are of that gravity that I really think the Prime Minister should suspend Dominic Raab.
Jacob Rees-Mogg says, beware of snowflakery.
Well, that's a classic Jacob Rees-Mogg comment, completely out of touch with reality. I mean, that's the problem with this government. I don't think they understand real people's lives, whether it's the cost of living, what's happening in the NHS, and how you should behave to your employees. Jacob Rees-Mogg typifies the Rishi Sunak government, that they're not in touch with reality.
Yeah, but there's a lot of pressure at the top of government, isn't there? You know, people like Dominic Raab having to make critical decisions in the moment. He needs to be able to express himself to his close team.
I was a cabinet minister and I served under real pressure. You should treat everybody with respect. And frankly, the best way to get the best out of your civil servants isn't to bully them, but to thank them. And I found that was the best way. Treat people with respect, and you can work as a team and you can get best results. If you shout and scream at people, surprisingly enough, you won't get the best out of them.
But you're innocent until proven guilty as well, aren't you? He's the Justice Secretary, and you know nothing has been found against him at this stage.
No, I'm more than willing to wait till the KC has been in charge of this review reports to make the judgment. But I still
the King's Counsel, a lawyer.
The King's Counsel. I beg your pardon. But I do think, in the meantime, he should be suspended because the allegations are so serious. And it goes to the weakness of the Prime Minister. You know, he's not prepared to take the action when faced with the facts. And you know, one of the things we'd like to see is the independent minister advisor on ethical standards look into what the Prime Minister knew and when with respect to these allegations of bullying against Dominic Raab. Did he appoint Dominic Raab knowing these serious allegations were there?
Talk to me about the social care announcement. Many of our viewers this morning will have seen you appearing in our Jason Farrell's report. £200 million being offered to put this plan into effect. Is that enough money?
It's nowhere near enough. I mean, I welcome that there's some movement at long last, but independent analysis has shown we need £2 billion over the next 4 years to start putting some of this scandal right. I mean, there are children out there, people who've in care homes, children who are not being looked after properly, and that should be a scandal in our society. These young people are some of the most vulnerable in our society. Their whole lives will be blighted if they're not treated properly as a child and a young person. And one thing that the Liberal Democrats want to do is not just about money, it's about the system. And I've been a strong advocate of supporting kinship carers, and my Liberal Democrat colleague Manira Wilson has put forward a set of proposals, a proposed law that would give kinship carers, grandparents, uncles, aunts, brothers and sisters, close relatives to the young person when the parent can't take care, give them more rights and more support. That must be the way forward, where you're supporting the family. And the fact the government doesn't seem to get that is quite shocking.
And we have a kinship carer actually on the programme later on to talk to us in more detail about this. Now, Boris Johnson, never far from controversy, as we know, said yesterday that anyone who suspects he covered up lockdown parties while PM is out of their mind. Are you out of your mind?
I think it's more likely Boris Johnson out of his mind. He's in total denial, isn't he? You know, the thing about Boris Johnson, right, the reason why I think he behaved so shockingly with those parties in Number 10, allegations of sex in the basement during his time there, you know, I think...
Not him, we have to...
Not him, but, you know, he was... In Number 10, it's his building, and he allowed these parties and this behaviour to go on during lockdown when everyone else was abiding by the rules. The fact that he says that shows that he just deceives himself just as much as he deceives the rest of the world.
The National Audit Office examining the decision to spend £220,000 of taxpayers' money for the Prime Minister's legal defence bill. If it's proven that some of the delay in him this coming to the fore was as a result of Mr Johnson's actions, should he be expected to pay some of that money back?
Well, I think he really needs to be held to account better than's happened so far. You know, I personally think he was unfit for office from day one. I was shocked that the Conservative Party put him into power, and the way he then treated so many people and lied to so many people and made such a hash of being Prime Minister is actually a stain on the Conservative Party. And although he's now been thrown out, not before time, I think he needs to be fully held to account. And all these various investigations that there are now into what happened need to conclude. And whatever the recommendations they come forward with, I think they should be implemented.
OK, it's always great to see you. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks a lot, Sir Ed. And as I was saying, you can see, Sir Ed, in the report by Jason Farrell a little bit later on in the programme. Quick look at the papers for you now. And The Guardian carrying an exclusive report which says the National Audit Office is looking into how £220,000, just talking about that, weren't we, of taxpayers' money was used to pay for the legal defence of Boris Johnson during the investigation into breaking lockdown laws. The Eye looking at the prospect of former PM Liz Truss returning to the spotlight and potentially causing new Conservative Party rifts. And the Daily Telegraph picking up on the RAF being in crisis over its drive for diversity. Tomorrow is here. Good morning, good morning. Pressure mounting on Dominic Raab and the Prime Minister.
That's right. On Rishi Sunak's 100 days in power, is Dominic Raab proving a major problem for the Prime Minister? Look, there's lots of pressure now for him to be suspended while this investigation carries on into whether he bullied civil servants. There are said to be up to 24 complaints. The government have admitted that there are at least 8. And the message I get from number 10 is that the long-standing convention is that ministers stay in post while they're being investigated. Look at Priti Patel when she was investigated. Look at Nadeem Zahawi, the party chairman, who was investigated for a short period. They tend to stay in post. They say there's no precedent for that, but you've got lots of people saying if this happened in any other walk of life with allegations of this severity, people saying they felt suicidal, then they would be asked to step aside until the investigation is complete. The Prime Minister continuing to get questions on this when he wants to be talking about other things the government is doing. Of course, he's had a very difficult first few months in power, but when you ask his allies what are his achievements, they say the big one is the first thing he did after taking over from Liz Truss, which is basically getting the markets back on track, bringing in a spending squeeze to get the public finances back on track. They think that's his biggest achievement so far, and he's outlined the 5 things he wants to do in the next couple of years.
Yeah, but what about the unions? They're saying that he needs to be put to one side for now because those in the department are potentially not safe while he's there.
That's right.
Strong words.
Very strong words, both from Dave Penman of the Civil Service Union and from Labour and the Liberal Democrats, who say that if someone is accused of bullying, they shouldn't be just left there potentially to carry on doing it while this investigation carries on, that people may be at risk. Dominic Raab, of course, says he's behaved professionally. He's essentially said that he's demanding, he expects the best from people, but he doesn't think he ever crossed the line into bullying. I'm sure Rishi Sunak's desperate for this all to be wrapped up pretty quickly, but people are still giving evidence to this inquiry, so it's hard to see how it will be brought to a close until at least the end of this month.
Hi again, everybody. You're very welcome to join us on The Breakfast Show here on Sky News. Thursday morning, a petition signed by 100,000 members of the public, nursing staff and patients, will be delivered to 10 Downing Street today, calling on the Prime Minister to pay nurses fairly. Joining us now is the crossbench peer, Lord Crisp, a former NHS Chief Exec. Hello, Chief. Very good to see you. Thanks for joining us on the programme this morning. How do you think the NHS is being dealt with at the moment?
Well, I think we've obviously got a crisis, a really serious crisis. Can I just qualify that? I've talked to quite a lot of people in recent days, and not everything is bad. So there are, a million encounters between patients and the NHS every day, and some people get very good care. So let me just make that clear. Nevertheless, this is really serious, and I think one of the big problems here is that people is morale. Actually, it's not just the pressure. People don't seem to have any hope that things are going to change. So I know the Prime Minister is trying to get a grip on this, but I think there's more to do, and settling the strike and moving on is very much part of it.
Yeah, I mean, the government. We hear quite a lot about talking about reforming of the NHS. What do you think that could look like?
Well, I think in some things that are being said at the moment are very good, which is a much more care being provided in communities and in people's homes. And here's an interesting point, which is that actually that is going to depend very much on nurses. Nurses in the community, nurses, district nurses, practitioner nurses. Nurses can play a much bigger role in the NHS in the future. So I think, two of the things are about a much bigger investment in the community, a much bigger investment in nurses. But let me also say there's a paradox here, which is you can't improve the NHS by improving the NHS. And let me explain what I mean. If you think about where a lot of the problems that come to the NHS come from, they come from things that aren't in the NHS's control. They're about stress, they're about obesity, they're about air pollution and so on. So we actually need it's not just reforming what happens within the NHS, it's reforming what's happening within society so that we've got a society that promotes and creates health. I, for example, have got a bill in front of the House of Lords about improving housing because actually damp and dangerous and cold housing is very bad for health. So there's got to be reform within the NHS, facing much more to the community, but also reform in wider society so that employers and others take a bigger role in promoting health.
Let's talk about nurses. You brought up nurses' pay there. Nurses on strike for the first time, basically, in their history for a national strike. Using food banks basically just can't cope, is what we're being told. And then we look at the other end of the scale, and NHS bosses are earning £255,000 more, certainly almost all of them more than £100,000. Looking at another one here from St Thomas's, the guy in charge there, £178,000. There's quite a disparity there, isn't there?
Oh, there is a disparity. I have to say it's not as big a disparity as you get in a lot of private sector companies. You ought to remember that Guy's St Thomas's has a turnover of, I think, somewhere around about £750 million. So this is FTSE 100 territory. So actually, you've got to be dealing with a whole lot of major complexities. So I think you can argue for support those salaries, but the difference between them and nurses is only something like whatever that works out at, about 6 or 7 times, whereas in industry it may be 100 times. So let's be clear that there's big differences there. But what you're saying about nurses is absolutely right. I do believe they need to be better paid. There need to be better career opportunities. They need to be able to work to their full potential. And I do hear nurses, and I've done quite a lot of work with nurses in recent years, saying that if they let us work to the level at which we're trained, we could make a bigger difference. And this is nurse practitioners, it's people in the community, people in districts. I do think promoting and developing nurses is one of the golden bullets, if I can put it like that will actually help health services, not just in this country, actually, but improve. This is a global issue that we still don't treat nurses as the true professionals that they are.
And in this present pay round, do you think that nurses then should be treated as a special case?
Well, I would do so, but then I've only looked at nurses. So, of course, I would say that. So I can't argue about teachers and all the rest of it. I just don't know the circumstances. But I think the most important thing is that the Prime Minister, I believe, is trying to get a grip. Well, I think he does need to get a grip. And I think part of that is not to let this strike go on much longer. Both sides need to give. There needs to be a negotiation. There needs to be an understanding of how you're going to take this forward. And the people need to be given some hope and some vision for the future. And I'm sure that vision is about a much more community-based service so that hospitals can do the things that only hospitals can do, because hospitals are fantastically important. But an awful lot of the care that needs to be given can be given in the community with improving technology. And over 5 or 10 years, we'll see that happening.
Final thought before I let you go, some suggestions that we should be paying to use the GP, even paying to use accident and emergency. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I nearly said that's nonsense, but I think the difficulty here is if you pay to use a GP, well, you'll end up in accident and emergency, won't you, instead of doing that, unless you make people pay for that. But the issue here is let's sort out how you deliver services and then decide how you pay for it. People jump to wanting to decide. It's not an economic issue, this. It's not a financial issue. It's a health issue. How do we want health services to be delivered in the future? And once we're clear about that, then let's have the discussion about funding, but don't funding and financing, but don't jump to funding and financing solutions, because you'll find that you've just done something, you've changed the finances, other problems pop up, you haven't solved the problem, and we'll have crises like this year after year. You need fundamental change in the way the service is delivered.